Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America. Thank you for listening to the show. We got Bud on Zoom. We're making things work with a few technical difficulties. So I think everything's coming through loud and clear. But if Bud sounds like he's performing at Woodstock or something like that on occasion, no worries. He's fine. He's not captured. We're just making things work this way. So, Bud, can you hear me? Am I coming in clear?
Oh, yeah. I think the bigger issue is I'm recording from home, so I could be invaded by a swarm of children at any moment.
That's right, like the opening threat. Speaking of being invaded in the new semester, we've already been invaded, but in a positive sense, with all of our good students who've started back at Mercy College, mchs.edu, Mercy College, underwriting our show. Thank you for doing that. And yeah, Bud, I'm the senior advisor for mission initiatives out there at Mercy College. You are the associate or assistant. Which one?
Associate to the provost. No, associate provost. And right now we don't have a provost. So the most demanding part of my job is being the weather czar and deciding about weather cancellations.
That's right. You have to.
People care about that a lot.
You have to look into your crystal ball and decide how those things work out. But yeah, so we're in full swing with the new semester. That doesn't mean, of course, that people shouldn't head over to the website, mchs.edu. There's always the chance to get started for a summer start or a fall. But we're glad to have our students back. But we were just having a week of welcome earlier. And it's always nice to have that because then there's things like tacos and Oreo cookies and stuff. But it's also just great to know that our students are back in full swing with the semester.
I selfishly like the week of welcome. I know it's geared towards students, but I do swing by the food tables after the students have gotten first dibs.
So if you want to be not only, it's nice to get Oreos and tacos, but if you want to get a great education so that you can go into the field of nursing or allied health and help serve people to continue that service and ministry of healing that Christ started and that the Sisters of Mercy shepherded throughout their existence and, brought it to here in Iowa, you can do so with us at Mercy College, mchs.edu. Bud, we have a wonderful interview with our friend Renee Roden. We get to all sorts of places, and I want to make sure to give her enough time. So we're going to go ahead and hit the break. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you here on Iowa Catholic Radio and all of our affiliates, and also online if you've figured out this podcast thing. It's great to be with all of you as we are here in the new year doing our new thing. We're talking about new beginnings. We'll probably be talking about new beginnings for a while until you are sick of how old it is. But in the meantime, enjoy the newness. It's going to be a grand time. Today, we're talking with, we have people we usually call Uncommon Good All-Stars, meaning that they've been on the show multiple times. Our buddy here has not been on the show, but I felt like I've talked about it so much, she already feels like an Uncommon Good All-Star. Her name is Renee Roden. Renee, you do a lot of stuff, so if you don't mind introducing yourself for the good listeners, and then we'll get further into our interview here. So Renee, what's all the stuff that you're up to?
All right, great. Well, thank you for having me, Bo and Bud. I'm excited to finally be on The Uncommon Good. It's an uncommon honor. So I am a writer, which is sort of a broad category that everything I do mostly fits under. I began writing as a playwright, and I still do playwriting. I worked on a play with your last guest, Brett, and one of our friends, Mike Murphy, this fall. So that was kind of my recent foray back into playwriting post-pandemic, which was wonderful. And then mostly I earn my bread and butter such that it is as a journalist. And I report a lot on the Catholic Church and various Catholic lay movements. So I don't really cover bishops so much or the shenanigans in Rome as much as it is sort of what's happening at parishes and at things like the Catholic Worker, which I'm a part of. I started reporting on the Catholic Worker movement 2-ish years ago, and sort of through various movements of my own heart and the spirit, ended up joining a Catholic worker in Chicago, where I live now, which is I will say, like, I owe an editor a piece right now, and my excuse has been that we've had a lot of emergencies at the Catholic worker, which has the added benefit of being factual, but it is an excuse. So it is great. So I live in community there are 4 workers here who've all sort of discerned being here, and we care for the house and we care for the community and sort of run the ship. And there are 9 guests currently with us who are recovering from homelessness. And then we have kind of a rotating cast and crew who come in. Like right now, when we're recording this, it's 5 p.m. and on a weeknight, which is when we open our doors and let everyone in. And usually there's soup or something on the stove that we serve. So I think that's mostly what I do.
Well, and you mentioned what exactly brought you to mind when we decided to do New Beginnings and talk to friends and interview them about this sort of nebulous concept of what does it mean to have new beginnings. You're an original Midwesterner, but you had lived in New York City for quite a bit, and as you said, you were brought back into the Central Time Zone over to Chicago precisely because of the Catholic Worker House. Now, we're not going to make this 40 straight minutes of you giving us biographical details. That's not fair to anyone. But I think as a writer, as an artist, here we are in January. Here we are doing a new show. Here you are having lived a bit in your new city. I think there's something to the new and the old, the ever ancient, ever new aspect of Christianity that always gives us pause and frames us talking about what does it mean for something to actually be new, and how much of what has to come before allows things to be new. And I just think you're the perfect person, both in your background and what you're currently, living through, to talk about this more with us.
Yeah, I mean, where to start? But I kind of shared this with you guys when we were talking about the idea for the episode. But I think the first image that comes to mind, or maybe the first line that comes to mind when I think about this question of newness or making something new or renewal, is this line that actually my boyfriend's father said. We had this round table. We were talking about the roots of the Catholic worker movement, and we were doing a roundtable discussion where we were reading some articles, discussing it. And I honestly can't remember the context besides a general sort of speech about sort of the hopelessness of our current state of affairs. But he said something really powerful that has really stuck with me, because I am sort of a middle of the road millennial, like very much dead middle of the millennial generation. So, headed to college soon after the crash, always been told I won't be able to own a home, like very much there's a certain narrative that we had that I feel like is very typically millennial. So I feel like what my boyfriend's father, Steve, said just really captured, I feel like, how so many of my peers feel. And he just goes, he was kind of, really distressed about this facet of culture or that. And he was just like, nothing is happening. And I just thought that was such a wonderful, encapsulation. I feel like how so many of us felt, and even how I felt. And, I think there's a lot of jokes about the end of history being announced in the 1990s, and all of a sudden, oh, we're back in history. We've had a pandemic that's completely sort of upended our lives. And now we're on the brink of, unfortunately, looks like an expanding war, right? So it's like, okay, things are happening. But I just find that so much of how the life that I was trained in my education at an elite American Catholic school, the life that I was trained to have or trained to desire or formed for, was a life in which nothing was supposed to happen. So I find it really interesting that we're in these, I find actually the largest problem in our culture right now, as I see it, is that we've gotten to this point where so many old institutions aren't working anymore. Dating is one that comes up a lot because it's very interesting. Everyone has to go through it mostly. And it's a pretty big evolutionary problem if you're talking about like continuing the species. Like this is a ritual that I feel like has evolved to a point that we don't have any dating rituals anymore. And then there's like, how do we create new ones? And we're not sure how. So I feel like that's a sort of like lightning rod situation, but there are many things like this. Maybe the millennial one is not knowing how to put down roots or have a house or build a family, or you can't afford it. And so, yeah, I think that we've gotten to this point where we've kind of moved away, or we've critiqued the old institutions, but we can't actually do anything new. Like nothing is happening. And so I think that problem of how to do something new is one that I'm thinking about. And I feel like we are in such a phase of renewal in the church with this synod on synodality, the Eucharistic revival. Clearly, we are wanting renewal, but I think that's actually our problem. Is like, our problem is, how do you do something new?
Renee, I'm glad you shared some of your experience, living in a Catholic worker house. And I've always found Dorothy Day really challenging on these questions. And when we ask, like, what's the task that faces our generation of Catholics, it can feel like we're facing something sort of unique. But this question of the relationship between the old and the new, it seems like it was there from the very beginning. And it's almost like a perennial one. So I think all the way back to like the Council of Jerusalem and, this idea that Gentiles didn't have to be circumcised to be part of the family of God, and how explosive that was. And it required like a church council to hammer it out. But with Dorothy Day, if you could share maybe some of the ways that she's like inspired your spiritual journey. I know at the time, I feel like she was doing kind of Razor Smot, like recovering aspects of Christianity that have been sort of obscured. And bishops and others in that context found that really challenging. But I think she's a really powerful example of someone who like blended well this commitment to tradition, but also like moving in new directions as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think the two aspects, or two sort of spiritual lessons I've gotten from Dorothy Day that really kind of tap into what you're saying, this old and the new, or the old flowering into the new, is her involvement with the liturgical movement and her commitment to the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so the first liturgical movement is something I've been researching for an article I've been working on, but she was very close friends with Virgil Michael, who was one of the liturgical movement's American instigators. He founded the journal Aurores Fratres. Might be butchering that, but you guys can correct me if I am. He really was trying to share the mission of the liturgical movement to involve the laity in liturgy, to make the liturgy the central devotion, right, or the central sort of spirituality of the church's life, both the Mass and the Liturgy of the Hours. So he shared, when Dorothy Day and Peter Morin published The Catholic Worker, he was very excited by it. And he got in touch with them and was very complimentary about what they were doing. And he sent them a lot of books from Collegeville so they could pray Compline and morning prayer. And I didn't realize this. It's kind of hard to imagine this, because that seems like that's a devotion I'm very used to. It's something that's always been a part of my spirituality. But when they first introduced us at the Worker, there were a lot of Catholics there who were like, what are you doing? Like, we're going to pray the rosary. We're good Catholics. Like, what is this nonsense, right? What is this monastic nonsense? And just how right now we see that really as like being in touch with the life of the church, the sort of liturgical breath of the Psalms, of praying the monastic hours, of this being in touch with this deep rooted history. And that was really radical when the lay people started doing it at the Worker in the 30s. And I think in many ways, she was very much ahead of Vatican II, and she was sort of leading a lot of these lay movements going into the council. So then the second, I think the universal call to holiness that's become this sort of cliche of Vatican II. I think Dorothy Day is an American saint, and I find her so compelling, as a writer and as a young American woman. I just can relate to a lot of her life. She's just not that far removed from me. New York hasn't changed that much since 1933. So, I just really find her commitment to the evangelical councils so powerful. And I think I've just been thinking about those a lot going into the new year, because we don't really think about them a lot. We don't take them seriously. And I think obviously, like chastity is something that's countercultural, both I think in terms of like this post-sexual revolution, anything goes, or like this sort of not even knowing how to form the forces of our sexuality within us. And then also sort of this puritanical backlash that refuses to sort of talk about sexuality or its importance or how to integrate it in our lives in a virtuous way. So this sort of like prudence of chastity and this desire to like use our passions well and be guided by love and rooted in love. And then this obedience, right? Like I think I think if you look at, American Catholic media, there's so much division and there's so little prioritizing, even though I think many writers and editors feel this in their hearts. There's so little prioritizing unity, right? We are the body of Christ. We are a corporate entity of believers. Like, how do we have discussion and dialogue and debate and disagreement, but like keep that obedience to the unity of the church at the forefront? So I think that's something I've been thinking about in terms of obedience. And then poverty, I think, is this big, so I shared that I was always, I grew up acting. So I'm from Minnesota, as Bo alluded to. I'm from the Midwest. Always been a proud Minnesotan. Sorry, Iowans. And so I grew up acting in the Twin Cities, and art there was just no question in my family that I was going to go major in theater, which is hilarious, right? Never did my parents say to me, you should have a practical major. It's like, okay, Renee is an artist, whatever. And I remember, I think so much about how art formed me as a young person, and then going to Notre Dame in undergrad. Notre Dame is much richer now than it was when I went. It has a much more like elite student body. But even then, I was really intimidated by the amount of wealth that I saw around me. I was just a little homeschooled girl from Minnesota, and, walking up to everyone saying, I'm majoring in theater, and confused about what finance was. Like, I didn't really know what finance was. Or economics. I distinctly remember one of my friends explaining what econ was to me, because I'd never taken an econ class. And yeah, so I think I have always found it really hard to know how to be an artist in the world. And artists talk about this a lot in terms of day jobs, making it, commercial success. Like, do you be an amateur artist? Do you sell out? Like, there's I think this natural tension with financial success and being an artist, because being an artist is just so different from the narrative you get at an elite college, which says, go become a Deloitte consultant. Like, you should make a $70,000 salary right out of college, right? It's just like, there's all these realities that just don't jive with being an artist and doing something because you love it and it has no financial value, really. And so I really always struggled with that. And it wasn't really until I started reading a bit about Dorothy Day and, getting to know the Catholic worker movement. And it's so silly because I read it all the time. And I read, go sell what you have, and like, go give it to the poor, and like, be poor and sell what you have and follow me. Like, you read it all the time if you're in theology school, right? And yet, we have all of these excuses for why we can't do that. And I started dating a Catholic worker, and one of the most, I think, attractive things was that he took that seriously. And it's like, well, he takes that seriously, and Dorothy Day took that seriously, and Jesus took that seriously. So why did it take this person? It's just, but it really is that personal witness. When you see someone like, I just remember, like, when we started dating, James would say, like, poverty is so freeing and it's creative. And I really have seen that, I think, in my own life, right? Like, and I am not living voluntary poverty in any radical way. Like, I've started by giving up my credit cards, like, that's just like, it's a very tiny thing, but just how can you embrace the freedom of not having a lot? And I think that, I don't know. So I think poverty, chastity, and obedience for me, right, according to Vatican II, right, all of us are called to them, not just people who take vows, and we live them in different ways. But I think those are really fruitful avenues of tradition that Dorothy Day reflected on a lot. I see her witness in her own life. And I think those are sort of strands of tradition that help us really think, how can I make something happen? Like, how can I live my life as though the truth were real, and as though the virtue I see in these saints is possible for me? Like, I think we were talking about this pilgrimage that James and I did, a walking pilgrimage this summer across New York State, and we begged for hospitality along the way. And, we were telling friends about it and saying, how many people would see us? We'd say, like, yeah, we're like two Catholic workers doing this walking pilgrimage, begging for hospitality, sometimes getting denied hospitality, sometimes getting it. And people were eager to identify as Catholic. And I was like, yeah, I think that's because Catholics are supposed to be crazy. You're supposed to be a little bit crazy, and not in like a scary way, in like a St. Francis way, like in a Jesus way, in a way that people are like, you're bananas, like something different is happening here. And I think that sort of authentic, good, crazy is, I think that's a sign of someone who's in touch with tradition and also doing something radical out of that tradition.
We're heading up on our first break, but to encapsulate some of what you're talking about, I love, I'm always for telling people they need to be crazy or strange, or Catholics need to be weird. I think this idea of poverty, because there's always questions about, poverty in some way measured in one term is always relative, like, oh, or you're poor compared to someone else. And so I know that I've had questions with friends, like here in Des Moines between Bud and I, where we're like, there's poverty, but really what it seems like, a lot of us could go be poor knowing that our families could bail us out at any time. It's more like precarity, right? Are we willing to actually trust God to provide for us in this way or that? And what I'm getting at is, I think this might be a clue to talking about why it seems like nothing can happen, and why it really is the case that we need the old for new things to actually truly to emerge. We want new things as long as we have like a rein on them. So like, and because it's really hard for us to imagine what can come next and us be in control of it, I think that's why we all think like we're running out of ideas. When you sort of fall into the lap of tradition or of God or like the church itself and relinquish knowing what comes next, that's when new things truly come about. But you're not going to be in control of them, right? They're not going to be your pet projects. And I reading your story, which people can go, find that online about, you wrote about the pilgrimage. And in many ways, that's like a daily experience of, well, we're not going to be in control about the new thing. Because the new thing for you guys was, well, where's the new place we're going to stay? And you really didn't have a lot of control over that. I think it's very illustrative of our point. We're going to take a break. When we get back, how about we start there? Because I think that's a really good place to get started talking about this. And then we can go from there. We've also promised you that we'll reserve some time for you to ask us questions. And we're worried because you do reporting, so you actually know what you're up to. So we'll be back with Renee Roden. Stick around. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you here on Iowa Catholic Radio, on other stations and affiliates, and also if you are listening to the podcast online. Thank you for listening to the show. We appreciate it greatly. Continuing here in the second half of the show with our interview, we have our good friend Renee Roden. Renee, thanks for joining the show, and thanks for sticking with us for both segments. Now, I want to point out, like to continue on from what we were talking about last time, we introduced a very interesting element of, we keep going back to your biography because the fact of the matter is, Renee, you live an interesting life. That's kind of a curse too, so I'm just telling you that. But what you did before you shortly moved out to Chicago is you actually went on a pilgrimage where you begged for hospitality. You hiked across to New York. I'll let you get the details. But the reason that I think it's interesting for you to bring that up is because, like we were talking about in the first segment, there's this paradox that we've obviously been talking about new beginnings, that newness often arises from things that are actually don't look like they change at all. And there's something about the past that if we relate to it well, the future, so to speak, emerges. it can sound like we're being like weird poetic hippies, but actually, I was thinking about it. Economists have a saying. They say you got to spend money to make money. They know this thing too, right? And so I think this is what apostolic poverty is like. You have to empty your pockets if you hope to receive new gifts. You have to create space if you want there to be an embrace. You have to be willing to live in the past if you want to see a future emerge. And you have to, actually distrust yourself in a certain spiritual way if instead you're going to trust God. That can all sound, like I said, like poetry, except I think people know this, that there really is a very practical wisdom in a lot of this. I think that this was shown through your travels through New York, that people can go read. So if you don't mind pointing to where people can read the full account, and maybe talk about that a bit today.
Yeah. So we wrote a short piece about it for Catholic News Service, and it's on Crux. And yeah, I think it's called After Pilgrims are Greeted by Hospitality After a Rocky Start, or something like that, which kind of summarizes how it went. Yeah, so I was working on a story about Will Peterson, who's a fellow Midwesterner, who started a wonderful initiative called Modern Catholic Pilgrim to try to recreate or to sort of build up the spirituality of walking pilgrimage in the United States. And I've always wanted to do the Camino de Santiago in Spain, and I've just never been able to make it over there. It's hard to take a month off. It's expensive. All those sorts of barriers exist for me and for a lot of people, which is kind of why Will started this ministry to try to help support more walking pilgrimages in the United States. And I was interviewing him for an article for America Magazine. And I had just been kind of looking around upstate New York because I had a residency at Mount Savior Monastery, an artist residency. And I was looking at trails and hiking that we could do in this sort of rest period before moving to Chicago. And, when I was talking with Will, he described his first pilgrimage he ever did. He calls it his proto-pilgrimage because he didn't really have a goal, but he was working in Chicago and took the train out to Iowa. I can't remember the stop right now. Just kind of took the train as far as he could and then just started walking. And he spent the first night under a tree, and the second night he spent in a church. And, he really was seeking to really just embrace that call of God, to sort of trust that God would take care for him, to trust that he would be clothed like the lilies of the field. And as soon as I heard him talk about it, I was like, that's okay. I want to do that. Like, we're going to do that. So I started probably during the interview mapping out different churches that were a day's journey away in the Finger Lakes of upstate New York. And I'm curious too, just wondering how many areas in the United States have churches that are a day's journey away, roughly. We might be surprised. So I, was like, okay, this first and foremost, and I chose, my aunt has a house in Syracuse, and so she invited us to stay there for a week. So we're like, okay, we'll choose Syracuse as the endpoint. We're like, is there a shrine near Syracuse, Saint's Shrine near Syracuse? And Sister Mary Ann Cope, who is widely sort of known, her claim to fame is helping Father Damien of Molokai with the lepers in Hawaii. She has a shrine there because she's from there, and she founded multiple hospitals, and she's this incredibly talented leader. And she has sort of her own story that people can look up themselves. So we just sort of randomly chose the Saint's Shrine and planned out this journey. And I use the word planned loosely. I roughly had a route. We knew that mostly the churches that we would stay at. We sort of debated, like, do we call ahead? Do we have a letter with us? And I was really like, no, I just want to go, and I really want to see if I can trust God. Like, I want to just trust God and see what happens. And it was really exciting. Like, that first night, we asked for hospitality from a priest who didn't help us at all. The other couple priests that we encountered were very hesitant to open the doors or give any sort of what would be called hospitality in any culture, but they did help us. They offered us material aid. This priest really like did not know what to do. He was very befuddled by two people asking for help. And I think that's something we talked a lot about on this pilgrimage, is just how uncomfortable Americans are asking for help. And yeah, the suspicion that's created. And so we spent the first night sleeping in a gazebo in the middle of the town square. It was, I mean, even then I felt we were so cared for, because there was tons of rain coming down. And there was one moment where there was tons of wind coming in, and we were like, oh no, we're going to get soaked, even though we're under this like very broad gazebo with plenty of roof coverage. But then the wind stopped, and all night it just rained. So people stayed out of the park, but we were safe. Yeah. And yeah, it's really something to pray night prayer and be like, all right, like, hide me, Lord, in the shadow of your wings, like guard me as the apple of your eye. And you're like, okay, like, I actually need you to do this. Like, I'm not like praying this, like going to bed in my like little safe bed. I'm like out in the middle of the open. I don't know what's going to happen. And yeah, I feel like, and then afterwards, I mean, the next night we were housed by these two wonderful sisters, and we just met we formed these really rich friendships, and just found this really rich community along the way, because I think it was so, we received so much. And in return, I feel like there was this exchange where like the people who offer hospitality, we talk about honored guests, and we forget that it is an honor to receive a guest, that is. And I felt that so many people did receive us as Christ. Like they saw so much honor and joy and delight in receiving these two strange pilgrims into their home. Yeah, it was a very powerful experience. And I highly recommend anyone do it. Just give it a try. Just start walking. But really it was basically that simple, to just walk. And I think that was also really, yeah, it's a very accessible way of accessing. You don't need much money. We didn't have any. Like, you don't need a lot to carry. You don't need to train that much. And you can really sort of, yeah, it's a really old, right, kind of this old and new. It's a very, very old way of going on a spiritual experience. And I think there's something about it that makes it, a pilgrimage is kind of what John Henry Newman, shout out to Bud, would call a living idea, right? It's this really powerful idea that how we move through the day is symbolic of our whole movement through life and our journey towards God. And so I think this idea that is always sort of being a living idea, the one that's always being reincarnated a new way and always sort of bearing fruit in new ways. And I see a lot of beauty in this call that we'll feel to create walking pilgrimages. And I think going on one myself, I can say it feels like it has a lot to teach us in our current what we were talking about, this sort of current society where we may feel a little stuck. We may feel like we don't know really the way to move forward, and we may feel suspicion. It's hard to trust people. It's hard to trust God. And I think the pilgrimage is a very literal, concrete way for us, at least, like asking for hospitality, begging for what we needed, was a very concrete way of reigniting our trust in God and in the body of Christ around us, right? So many people were so kind to us. And yeah, we kind of deprive ourselves of that gift of feeling our fellow humans' kindness. So I think that's important.
Well, in the great pilgrimage of radio shows, we're moving to the part where if we're going to have enough time for you to ask us questions, we need to turn that. So that, speaking of new beginnings, anyone who's just catching on in the new year, we're now opening ourselves up if people want to ask questions of us. It's gone great so far, but it's only been one episode. So Renee, see if you can keep it going, or I don't know, stump us and embarrass us. That would be pretty fun too. So you have questions for Bud and I you would like to ask?
Yes. Okay, we'll start with a softball. What are you reading right now?
Bud, you can go first.
Oh man. See, my problem is I have so many books on the nightstand that it's like, what am I reading? I'm reading 10 pages here and there. Fiction wise, I've restarted The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I'm part of a reading group, and I've been really bad about regular participation in the group. But when I saw they were reading Cormac McCarthy, I was like, I have to make next month's meeting. And then when it comes to like theology proper, I've been skimming von Balthasar, but don't ask me questions about the content because it really has been pretty surface level at this point.
Yeah, on my end, I've been reading Moby Dick for fun, and then I've been reading Henry IV Part 1 for this thing I'm helping with some kiddos. And then I'm reading a whole mess of things for the project Brett and I are doing together on media and theology. But it was just some more Marshall McLuhan stuff recently.
Nice. No, I love that you both have the Road. I've been reading a lot about Cormac McCarthy because of his new books that came out that look fascinating. And I love Moby Dick. And I just finished, I got like a book in the airport when I was traveling over Christmas. I splurged and I just read it cover to cover, which I'm the same way, Bud. There's a stack of books that I'm using for different things. And I felt it was really refreshing to just focus on one thing. Okay, great. So I've been talking a lot about ChatGPT. Bud and I have been talking a little bit about it. I'm sure kind of piggybacking off of Brett's thing, I've been thinking so much about how the difference reading books is than reading in any other capacity. So I guess I'm curious because this kind of relates to the internet, to book, to what we've been talking about. I'm not a parent. I don't have any children. And I guess that's what I'm curious about in your experience of family life and having children and forming them is I have several questions. But first of all, I guess I'm curious about how you pass on traditions to your children in both like large sort of liturgical year ways and in small ways. Like, how do you pass on culture to your children?
But are you going to go first, or do you want me to stab at it?
You can take a stab. You're probably more committed to passing on tradition than I am.
No, actually, what I was going to say is I actually think we're awful about it. Like a lot of times you're thinking like, oh my gosh, it's like we're bad night owls. Like my wife and I both are. My kids are really bad. So we're sort of like, hurry and pray night prayer so that the demons don't take them in their sleep or whatever. But what I realize with tradition, if it's not to be wooden, and I mean, like I'm also a convert, so I know that like when I first started being Catholic and then having kids, which was nearly simultaneous, like it was about 9 months different, that I was like really like, we need to manufacture tradition, almost in that sort of way that admits that it was being objectified. What you start to realize is you kind of accidentally pass on tradition, the better if you don't like hold white knuckle to it. Now, that doesn't mean you should ignore it. That's the sort of weird thing about it. At some point, you yourself are just swimming in the water of the tradition. And that's when you start to realize that your kids really imbibe it. And the way that is like I was just talking to a priest today, and they're like, oh, yeah, I was at a mass that your son was serving. And it's when the other kids, I'd say the body of Christ, and they wouldn't respond, your son under his breath would say amen. It was great. And you start to go, oh, we need other people. So it's not only that we need friends so we can see ourselves reflected in them and know what we're like. You also need the community to sort of see the reflection of your children and your family to know that sort of thing's happening.
Yeah, we've taken some small steps like St. Nicholas. It's a day with traditions that the kids can get into really easy with like gifts in their shoes and things like that. I think for myself, like a lot of these things kind of stand out because of the contrast of my own upbringing. So we do have like a shrine in our family room, and that's a place of prayer. It's cool for me to observe the kids like being drawn to that in different ways. And really, it's funny as a father, like their piety often surpasses my own. And so like just seeing like one of my daughters like being really regular with the rosary, or I don't know, our 2-year-old is kind of obsessed with water. And so like holy water is a big deal to her. And she's like always looking for an opportunity to cross herself with holy water.
Okay, you kind of both gestured toward this, but I'm curious, what is something you have learned recently from your children or from a child?
I mean, there's a lot. On one hand, I think of humility. Like, I don't get into details, but I was like telling them like, oh, I want you to be better than me. And then I said something that like I, as a teenager, did. And they were like, oh my gosh, you did that? And I was like, thank you, Sanhedrin, for putting me on trial. But if you're talking about, I always point out that my kids are infinitely more kind than I am. Now, people go, actually, Bo, you're more kind than you realize, and they pick it up. But in my mind, right, I'm not like I'm a 90s kid, and I say Seinfeld jokes at people, and I show that I love people by ribbing them and things like this. And the ability for my kids just to like be available to people they don't even know and make people feel welcome, talk about hospitality. That's something that like that they really have taught me. The negative thing they've taught me is I think like my kids all will just stand in doorways and it drives me crazy. And so then the other day I noticed myself standing in a doorway and I was like, okay, well, physician, heal thyself on that one.
Yeah, for myself, I think too. So I'm going to make like a really good old man if I get to that point, because I've got like a curmudgeon streak already at age 43. And I think like for a few of my kids, they've challenged me to be less grumpy. I don't know. Someone said to me, it was still about a decade ago, but they said like one of the losses for like our generation of committed Catholics is that we can't just be in the liturgy. Like liturgies become something that we talk about and analyze. And even though someone said that to me a decade ago, like, I don't know if I fully internalized the lesson. So I don't know. I was being grumpy about some part of Mass or this church that we attended. And like one of my daughters was like offended by this. And I think it was like that offense was good for me to hear.
Now, we probably have time for one more. I'm sorry to...
It goes quick.
We only have... Yeah, it goes very quick. So one more question for us.
Okay. This, I'm relating back to where we were a year ago. So I guess I'm curious, after this experience we went through of examining our digital ground, of looking at our own practice of engaging with media. I'm curious, so starting 2023, after the gift of this formation, what have you noticed is new, or what are you hoping to change? Like, what has changed about your relationship with this whole kit and caboodle of the digital age, and what would you like to change, or is there anything you're working on changing?
But you should go first. I need to be limited in my response to this.
Well, it's a thread that I've been in a lot of my conversations about these topics, and we talked about it briefly with Brett on a recent episode. But I really think like one of the biggest temptations when you engage media or think about it is to say like, if we just discarded something or walked away from it, like we could kind of extract ourselves from the tensions or the challenges that are involved. Now, I do think there's like a proper form of asceticism when it comes to media, but I've just been my 2-year-old I've just been challenged to like I guess especially like going back to the curmudgeon piece, like even at the college where we work at, so many of the conversations about media are like, the kids these days, like they're too attached to their phones, or like it's sort of like the problem is rooted here external to us, but it's an ecosystem that we live in. And so there's responsibilities on our part to think about how do we live faithfully in this context. But like so rarely is the problem like either external or something that we can just avoid by somehow hitting like an eject button that actually doesn't exist.
For me, as someone who has been a great books advocate, teaches great books, I've had to come to terms with the fact that books cause many of the problems that we lay at the feet of the digital, and take tons of heat for this, being a big advocate. And I still think books are great, but that is, I've had to go, in order to hold the positions that I think I hold and that we, hold from, CCEP, where, just to note to listeners, excuse me, like Renee was part of that, the thing we were talking about last week with Brett. I've had to take tons of heat from people, and usually it's good nature. They're like, "Oh, Bo, we thought you were the big book guy," and "Oh, so now you're big media." But it makes me realize that oftentimes when we go look for problems, we want to reify or thingify. We want to make the problem something else. This goes back to the chat bot, the AIs, where you can ask it questions and it responds back. It only has responses from inputs millions of humans have put into it. You can get mad at the robot, but the robot is a mirror. And if we see any medium acting, quote unquote, a certain way, it's us doing it. And so then that makes me think well, I'm contributing to that. And not only through the digital when I put stuff online, not if I write books or emails, but when I talk. Speech is still a medium that's alive. And when I talk, it has repercussions too. And so that is, I think, a good way to wrap up what we're talking about here. It seems like it's really new, the digital. In some ways, the digital's best aspect is a mirror about the way some things have always been this way. And that if we're going to do something truly new, we have to get back to the sources. So great question to end on. Renee, one more time, if you don't mind, let people know if they're interested in reading more of your work or engaging it, where are places they can do that?
Yes. I have a Substack called Sweet Unrest. That I usually put up articles that I've written. I have little reflections. So if you just search Sweet Unrest Substack, that is where you can find a lot of my stuff. Or you can come visit me at Chicago at St. Francis Catholic Worker House. Our doors are mostly always open.
Well, this is fantastic. We loved having you on. Thank you for being part of our new beginnings. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you here on Iowa Catholic Radio or our affiliates, or if you're listening on podcast. It is wonderful to be here with you. Bud, what I got to say, Renee hit that one out of the park. So much interesting stuff going on in her life. But I really do think maybe the first few episodes talking about new beginnings, you and I, we like to be theoretical. It was really nice to hear very practical implications from someone who, she has an eye and ear for those things, both as an artist, but also as a writer and someone who's done reporting and editing. I guess it's just a confirmation of what we're trying to get at in this new mini arc in our new episodes is not pure craziness. It has some real grounding in things.
No, I was really inspired, and I've been wanting to do the Camino walk of the Camino of St. James for a long time. It's probably not in the cards in the near future. So Renee kind of inspired me to think about an American pilgrimage. If American Catholicism could recover pilgrimage shrines, that would be, I think, a big step.
Now, I will say, I know that there's one down in Oklahoma that starts somewhere and ends at Clear Creek Monastery. And I'm thinking they're talking about, it would be a really long way. I think they're talking about doing something about Blessed Stanley Rother Shrine and maybe the monastery. That would be an incredibly long walk, but they might be doing that. But I think you need to get a hold of your in your old stomping grounds. You could have some extremely long, desolate pilgrimages out in Nebraska.
I guess both of our states are broad. So, but Nebraska, Renee talked about relying on hospitality. I think you'd want to make sure you at least had sufficient water as you departed.
Yeah, that might be true. You might need to make a very determinative choice about when these pilgrimages are. In fact, I know the one in Oklahoma is during the summer and Oodalali, but maybe if they do this a longer one, they'll figure out a better time to do it. Well, either way, folks, we're glad that you were with us. We're going to keep it up. We're going to have more guests we're going to interview and talk about new beginnings, ever ancient, ever new. The church full of surprises while being consistent, a wonderful paradox to live out our faith in. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good. And for Bud Marr, this is Bo Bonner. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, same time, same bat channel next week, buddy.
Sounds good. We'll talk to you then.
See you, folks.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.